Ideally, how much money should your man make?
8 figures.
8 figures.
7-figure men do go for me. Honey, how would you know that? You're not a 7-figure man. I'm telling you, in real life, in reality, not delusion, reality, I date 7-figure men.
Someone released a clip of me talking about some of the things we just talked about. And it went out on YouTube Shorts, and it's got like 5 million views in a month or something like that. And the comment section is unbelievably vitriolic. Every single comment is vitriolic. And it's all from women. It's like, who is this old white bastard telling us what we should do with our bodies?
Do you see the ONS data that came out a couple of weeks ago that said for the first time ever since records began, 50.1% of women are childless by 30. So there are more women without children at 30 than there are women with children. The first time ever.
Well, somebody clipped a part of one of my podcasts, I believe it was, where I was talking about what our society does to 19-year-old women, or 18-year-old women, 19-year-old women. We just lie to them all the time. You know, the first lie is, there's nothing more important than your career, more or less by definition. So that's the first lie. The second lie is, there will be nothing more important to you in your life than your career. So that's the second lie. And then the third lie is, there should be nothing more important in your life than your career. So that's the third lie. And then implicit in that is the idea that children are a burden, and that the idea that women should have children is part of the oppressive patriarchy and should be resisted. And who are men to tell me what I can do with my body? And hey, fair enough. And et cetera, et cetera. Now, I've worked in female-dominated occupations my entire life. For example, I worked as a daycare worker way back when that was like 1980, something like that. And there were no men doing that, but I really liked kids, and so that was fun. And I worked for social services in Alberta in the childcare department, and then I've been working as a psychologist, either training or as a psychologist since then, and that's been a female-dominated enterprise increasingly as the years went by. But even when I first entered it, so I'm in the post-female in the workplace generation firmly. I never experienced the world except as that, and so I've watched women progress through their professional careers at every level of attainment, from the lowest to the highest, and observed what happened, and relatively, I would say, bias-free, because I didn't know. And what I've seen is that as women progress towards their late 20s, there's a psychological transformation, and what happens is that they place less emphasis on their career and way more emphasis, particularly on having a child. And that really reaches a crisis point around 29 or 30 for the vast majority of women, and their attitude flips. And I've seen it flip very dramatically with many women. And I suppose the most convincing evidence of that, I worked with high-end lawyers in Toronto for about 10 years. I was part of an organization. We went to law firms, high-end law firms, and said, send us your most productive people, and we'll help them iron out whatever wrinkles there might still be in their life. And the advantage to them is that things will go better for them, and the advantage to you is they'll be even more productive. And there's a good management dictum, which is pay the most attention to your most productive people, because they're bringing in the bulk of your revenue disproportionately. And so I worked with men and women who were at the peak of their careers in a very difficult enterprise. And so these were women who were generally very attractive, well put together physically, pretty stable psychologically, extremely conscientious, very, very smart, and high achieving from like junior high all the way through high school, university, law school, onto the top firms, rocketing up through the ranks, full partnership by the time they were 29 or 30. And all the law firms, all the women bailed out, all of them. The law firms couldn't keep them. And I was really, and I talked to the women a lot about this, because I was very interested in it, because I knew the law firms were bending themselves over backwards and tying themselves into knots trying to retain these women, because why wouldn't they? You know, just being greedy capitalists is enough. They don't want to lose their high-performing women because they're performing at the highest level, and they couldn't keep them. The women wanted to have 9-to-5 jobs. They wanted to bind the job so they could have a life, and that was especially true once they got interested in having a child or had one. And what they really came to was a very interesting realization. So because they were highly conscientious women, they sort of did their duty and worked hard and diligently and didn't pop their head up to ask questions. They were in junior high, they got the best grades. They were in high school, they got the best grades, and so on, all the way through, right till they reached partnership. But that's sort of an apogee, right? You hit partnership in a senior law firm, it's like you're at the top of your profession. Well, then what? Well, so then they looked around and they thought, here I am with all these like hyper-competitive men, perfectly willing to work 80 hours a week, nonstop, to stay at the top. What the hell are they doing? Because that's the real question. What is it that characterizes this small percentage of hyper-competitive men? It's not. You can assume that that's how everyone should be, but first of all, that isn't how everyone is. Or you can flip that and say, well, there's only a small minority of human beings that are willing to do this, to work flat out 8 hours a week. I mean, they're certainly being paid for it. Let's make no mistake about that. But well, what about the rest of life? Well, that's what the women asked. Why am I doing this? And that's a great question. Well, for men, there's a different answer than for women. It's a really different answer. And it isn't like the men are exactly thinking this through. It's more like this is an integral part of male motivation. The more successful you are as a man, the more women like you. I released a video. I was going to conclude that other story. I released a video, or someone released a clip of me talking about some of the things we just talked about. And it went out on YouTube Shorts, and it's got like 5 million views in a month or something like that. And the comment section is unbelievably vitriolic. Every single comment is vitriolic, and it's all from women. It's like, who is this old white bastard telling us what we should do with our bodies? And I wasn't being judgmental. I was just saying exactly what I said to you, which is, well, I've watched women over the entire course of my life with, I would say, an affectionate eye. I love my sister, I love my wife, I have a daughter, I love my mother. I'm pretty happy about women, all things considered. I don't have an axe to grind in relationship to how they should conduct their lives. I don't even know how they should conduct their lives. I've watched what happens. And I've also watched what happens to women who hit 29 or 30 and then can't conceive. And that is not a fate I would wish on anyone. It's awful. And 30% of couples fall into that. 30% of couples have difficulty conceiving. It's a lot. And the probability that you'll have difficulty conceiving increases with age. And so, c'est la vie. But it's very interesting to me to see how vitriolic those comments have been and how uniform that is, because usually on my YouTube channel in particular, 95% of the comments are positive. And this is completely the opposite of that.
You wouldn't ever give up your career for a child?
But I wouldn't give my career up for the child. No way.
These modern women are now told that they need to be career focused. That's how you fulfill yourself. You're not going to be fulfilled at home. It's not intellectual enough.
They're not even really feminine like women used to be. You don't even have the domestic skills, the home skills. I would submit today that modern women are asking for an unfair deal from modern men.
I've seen this in my daughter. My daughter, although she had terrible health problems and that complicated her life a lot, she had initially thought that she might want to go be a physician. But that's like 12 years. And she was also very oriented towards having children. And she's managed to have one child despite her health problems. But that desire to pursue an intense educational pathway does exist in conflict, certainly with an early start to family development. If you presume that doesn't matter because you've got time, you're not going to find out that isn't true for 10 years in your own life, and maybe the culture won't find out that's true for like 30 years. We still tell young women who are 19. I made a comment that was clipped on an Instagram reel by someone about the fact that we always lie to young women about what's going to be important in their lives. We tell them it's going to be all career. I said, I've worked in female-dominated industries my whole life, and what I've observed is among men and women alike that it's a very rare person for whom career is the most important thing in their life, even if they're men, although it's true for more men. It's true for virtually no women by the time they hit 30. And the amount of vitriol that comment generated was unparalleled. And that's something, because I've had plenty of vitriol generated from things I said, but it was all young women, talking about how some old white guy like me had no right to tell young women what to do with their bodies, which I most certainly was not. But it is, you can see a simple pathway there, right? It's like, well, we have this avenue where we can pursue our career and our education and everything else we want, and then we'll be able to solve the problem of having a family. The problem with that is, well, it's hard enough to find a mate when you're 23, 24. By the time you're 30, it's even more difficult. And by the time you're 35, it's starting to become well nigh impossible to find a mate and get pregnant and have a family, especially if you're going to have more than one kid. And so there's a direct conflict there between the avenues that are open to women and the need to strike while the iron's hot on the reproductive front. Nobody really knows how to reconcile that. It's odd, because women will live about 7 years longer than men. So it could be the case that the societal norm could be that women have their children when they're quite young and then go back to school in their 30s. That would actually work out. In principle, that could work out quite nicely, but we don't have the norms in place to make that a possibility.
But there's so many ideas today about reproductive technology that are overstated.
Oh,
the idea,
yes, terribly.
Freeze your eggs and age 40, if you have a partner and if you still have energy, that you might then.
Yes, and everything goes well.
Yeah, if everything goes well.
And you have the money.
Yeah,
and the emotional stamina.
All of that. So it's both that the fertility window is much shorter and the ability to have children gets harder and harder and harder. It's not just about getting pregnant. It's about being able to deliver, being able to see the pregnancy through to, which gets exponentially harder very, very quickly. I should mention I interviewed 5 fertility doctors for the documentary itself. And, each one of them wanted to open up about the challenges because normally they have to sell their services.
Right.
Normally they have to tell people, think positively, here's what we've done for other people, here's what we think we can do for you.
Yeah.
What they were telling to me openly, I'm frankly getting quite emotional about on a couple of occasions, was it's terrible because so often it doesn't work out.
Well, 1 in 3 couples by the age of 30 have pronounced fertility problems defined as inability to conceive within a year of embarking on the endeavor consciously, right? So that's 1 in 3. And of course, it just gets worse and worse as age creeps up. And 30 is not that old. And it does mean that women have a damn tight window. It's 13 years, let's say, by the time you're 17. By some standards, you're mature enough to consider reproduction, 17 or 18, and on the extreme end. And then, 35 is the other end of that distribution. And you're playing with fire by the time you're delaying, especially if you don't have a partner, by the time you're delaying till 35.
Especially if you want 3 children,
Yeah, well, right. I'm thinking just 1, and it's also the case. I think if you're a reasonable observer of human nature, you see that people have 3 sources of fundamental gratification in their lives. One is the pursuit of their own interests, including career and job. One is their intimate relationship, and the other is their family. And obviously, the intimate relationship and the family are very integrally associated. And if you miss out on one of those, you may be able to fill it by exceptional ability in the remaining domains. But for most people, not only is that highly unlikely, it's also highly undesirable. So,
because to take the point as well, here am I, an older male talking about things that are very sensitive to women, but there are a lot of women out there saying the exact same thing. And there was one this morning. I got an email from Melanie Notkin, who's written a book called Motherhood, who herself has no children, and she put it succinctly that, in her words, women are going through the education path, the career path, to try to ultimately fall in love and have a family.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
It's all linked.
Yeah, well, I think it's the same for men.
I think so too.
Well, half the reason, it's more than that.
half the reason that men strive for career success is to impress women and attract them. In fact, it's higher than that. So,
but maybe that point is the heart of the problem we have today, because today, if you look at who's at college and who's actually earning more right now, I read this morning, women in cities in the US are earning more than men. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but you have this situation.
Yeah, it's right under 30. Yeah.
So in US colleges right now, there are, I believe it's 9.5 million women and around 6.57 million men.
Oh, and the women start dropping out of college, by the way, when they start to outnumber the men 2 to 1. Right? Because a lot of the reason people go to college, you got to ask yourself, what's college for? It's like, well, it's to get educated, to go to lectures, to be accredited. It's like, no, probably not. Probably the reason people go to college is to find a mate. And there's a selected pool there, and you have a decent chance of finding someone, of approximately your ability and forward-looking vision, let's say. And the reason people are willing to shell out between $150,000 and $250,000 for 4 years is in no small part so that they can find a mate. Well, and if you demolish that by, radically decreasing the number of available men, for example, you're just going to blow the whole enterprise out of the water, which is already what's happening.
And absolutely. And this is perhaps my greatest concern, because I think if we make young people more aware of the fertility window, they might want to have children earlier. If we link that to in some way enabling careers later in life, which has to fundamentally happen for this to work, we might still be left with a situation where women who, the term is hypergamy, where women typically want to marry someone at least as educated, at least as successful, taller than they are. But if we're in a situation where there's so few men getting the same level of education, we might be left with this imbalance.
That's already happening, clearly. Yeah, it's very difficult for women to overcome the hypergamous instinct, because they're trying to redress the imbalance in terms of reproductive responsibility. And there's no evidence at all. You get a little bit of egalitarian societies like Scandinavia, but it certainly doesn't disappear. And so that's built in at a very fundamental biological level. And I don't think any casual tinkering on the anthropological or sociological front is going to shift that a bit. So that's a big problem.
It's a big problem.
It's also the case, too, that if marriages where the wife out-earns or out-statuses the husband tend to be comparatively unstable and violent. So, now you can lay that at the feet of the men if you're inclined to, but in some sense it doesn't really matter, because that's the way it is. And so the women are unhappy and the men are threatened, and that's just not a good recipe for marital stability.
I don't believe that there is moral casual sex, because I don't think sex is casual. I don't think anything about it is casual. I don't think there's any such thing as a casual sexual relationship. I don't believe that. I've never seen any evidence that that's the case. I think that there are people rationalize that constantly because they want to believe that short-term hedonistic gratification is ethically acceptable. And I don't think it is. I think that it trains you to treat yourself and other people as instrumental objects of short-term pleasure, obviously. Mm-hmm. Well, is that how you want to train yourself? How's that going to work? You going to have a long-term relationship at some point? How are you going to train yourself for that? Okay, so having said that, and then how carefully should we conduct ourselves in sexual matters? I would say, well, as carefully as you conduct yourself in any matter of importance. And that stretches all the way up to the top, whatever the top is. You're going to treat the other person as if they're a divine locus of consciousness or a disposable pornographic entity. Well, those are the borders. Okay, but then you say, well, you have to practice. And there's truth in that. And how do you practice? And the answer is, well, that's one of the central complications of life, right? To get the balance between individual action and the whole domain of sexuality and reproduction right is perhaps there's no more difficult question, especially once you've solved the question of, do you have enough to eat tomorrow? Mm-hmm. That'd be the next one that pops up. But I don't think there is such a thing as casual sex. I think that's indistinguishable from masturbation, which I also don't regard as a particularly heroic act. And so, well,
T-shirts, masturbation, not a particularly
heroic
act.
And I think people have that sense, and I don't think that that's culturally instantiated, because in some sense we've done everything we can to eradicate every last vestige of sexual shame, which I think in the final analysis is impossible, because there are all sorts of reasons for the persistence of sexual shame that have nothing to do with cultural context. And still, it's a furtive and underground activity. And the reason for that is because it's suboptimal for all sorts of reasons. Well, how much motivation does a young man need to overcome his fear of rejection and establish a relationship with a woman? And the answer to that is, we don't know. But sexual deprivation could easily be part of it. Because to do something difficult, you need a lot of motivation. You need frustration working for you. You need fear working for you. You need lust working for you. You need loneliness working for you. To bind a man and woman together, especially if they're going to produce children, this is a very, very difficult thing to do successfully. And so anything that interferes with that is to be viewed with extreme skepticism, and that's undoubtedly part of the reason that shame around hedonistic sexual activities remains a constant, despite our best attempts to eradicate it.
I think I would also say, just from my experience growing up, especially in university, it's not like it's seen on the outside, having casual sexual relationships, as this fun thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not fun.
No.
And nobody thinks it's fun, especially women. So if you're around other girls and they're like, oh yeah, I hooked up with this guy, none of you guys are actually enjoying that.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's a lie that women tell each other.
Yeah. Why?
I think because they think other people don't care. And because if you do it, it makes you feel bad enough that you're like, well, I don't want to look at that. Whatever's going on there, like maybe me feeling bad is not healthy.
Right.
Like I'm not, and
it means there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, or there's something wrong with you, right? And so it's like, and it's unpleasant enough that you're like, well, I'll just, keep going. It's already happened. There's nothing I can do about it. So it might as well be okay, because what am I going to do about it if it's not okay?
Yeah.
So and then, and I think this is pretty common for women in university to hook up with people, right? It's called hookup culture. There's Tinder, like it happens. But I like for anybody out there who's thinking maybe I don't want to do that. It's not fun. It doesn't make you feel good. It really makes you really lonely, right? It's not a good idea.
Why do you think it makes you lonely?
I think because what you're looking for is connection with somebody. And you're getting this physical connection, and you're not getting any emotional connection. And it's
right, and then there's the contradiction.
It's
a terrible contradiction.
Yeah, and
right?
it's
here's an interesting thing I used to tell my clients is, don't do anything with anyone sexually that you wouldn't talk to them about.
Seems
it's like, well, I wouldn't talk to anybody about that. It's like, but you'll act it out,
Yeah.
So that's worth thinking about. So you're not intimate enough with them to have a conscious discussion, but you're perfectly willing to blunder stupidly into it, and then risk the aftermath. A lot of that's fueled by alcohol too.
Yeah, like a lot of it is fueled, like all of it. Yeah. You're not going to do that
if we ever
sober.
wanted to have a serious conversation about sexual impropriety on campuses, for example, the first thing we'd focus on is alcohol. But we don't want to have a serious conversation about that because, we don't want to have, we don't want to have chaperoned parties like there were in the 1950s. It's like, having some older people around to keep the drunken orgy under control actually turns out not to be such a bad idea.
Especially people who are non-biased, right? Are unbiased. We're just there saying, well, this doesn't look like it's going well. Maybe I'll help this person out.
Yeah, well,
instead of a group of friends, they're like, no, do it. Like,
yeah, right. Well, which is exactly
a bunch of doorknobs running into each other.
Well, that's what you get with alcohol too. Alcohol is a drug that really radically decreases people's medium to long-term orientation, right? It really focuses you on the present. which makes it, if it's a good drug for you, it makes it unbelievably fun because it decreases anxiety and it increases likely opiate bonding and dopamine mediated extroversion. And so, like, it's cocaine, heroin, and a benzodiazepine rolled into one. And so it makes you not care. And for pure hedonism, there's nothing better than not caring.
Yeah.
But alcohol is a catastrophe on many fronts because of that. And a huge proportion of violent crimes, exploitative crimes, rapes, a huge proportion of those are conducted between drunk people. And so, but I don't believe that there is moral casual sex, because I don't think sex is casual. I don't think anything about it is casual.
So it is about raising. I mean, is it about raising money for a cause, or is it about raising money for you?
Well, I don't separate myself from what I'm doing, so I can't really answer that question. I mean, for me, what am I going to buy, a yacht? No. You know, like, I'm not a luxury kind of guy. I'm not looking to live the high life. I'm 55 years old, for God's sake. What would I do with that?
When you talk, say, about domestic violence, in the end, if men are pushed too far by a too aggressive a feminism, there will be a backlash, and that there is, there's a sort of undercurrent of violence, be it verbal.
Oh, that's a warning, not a commentary
it's a warning
on the
that
utility
kind of
of that.
suggests that there may be sort of fault in those who push progressivism too far. They will get a backlash. Some people, of course, see that as a bit of a permissive environment for bad behaviour.
Well, people tend to confuse describing the likelihood of something with supporting the fact that it exists. And I'm describing the likelihood of something, not supporting the fact that it exists. If you push too far on the left, you're going to get a backlash on the right. That's how things work. And this is just a derivation of that as far as I'm concerned.
How does that work in the context of domestic violence?
Oh, I don't think it's applicable in the context of domestic violence at all. I think those things are completely separate issues.
I mean, you were mentioning to me just as we were chatting.
And I was speaking only politically with regards to the backlash. That was a comment on political backlash. It had nothing to do with domestic violence. That's a whole different issue.
But violence often pops up in your work as something you think drives things. That I think you've said in relations between men are regulated by a background threat of force, and in a sense that's why men have difficulty with women. Is it really so?
No, that's why men have difficulty with women who are completely out of control. But
who should control women?
Well, other women themselves, men, society, just like everyone is controlled. I mean, you're controlled by society, I'm controlled by society, and thank God for that. I mean,
funny. I mean, you described yourself as a liberal earlier, and I think a liberal doesn't think that a society controls women or men.
Well, let's say regulates. I'm a psychologist as well.
But what is an out-of-control woman? What is this creature? How do we know when we met one?
Well, I'm sure that you've met women in your life that acted towards you in a bullying and detestable manner. It's very difficult for women to cope with that because they don't have any real recourse. And female bullying can be unbelievably vicious. And usually that takes the shape of reputation destruction, innuendo, and gossip. It's well documented. It's very difficult to defend. No, men do it too, but men... No, but the patterns...
disproportionately women, in your view, or not? Sorry.
Yes, disproportionately women. That's what the data indicate. I mean, if
men are... Where is the data on innuendo and gossip?
Well, it's among antisocial behavior among adolescents. It's a well-documented field. So, because people look at aggressive and antisocial behavior in women and in men. And in women, it tends to take the expression of innuendo, gossip, and reputation destruction. And in men, it tends to take the form of outright physical aggression. There's a whole literature on that. It's not a surprise to anyone. This has been known for 30 years. I mean, the rates of antisocial...
I think the idea of the female gossip probably predates 30 years.
Well, it does.
By a long time, but that doesn't... doesn't make it gospel,
but
really,
people
does it?
No, it doesn't. But people have looked at how women express... Look, women have to express aggression somehow unless you're willing to say that they're not aggressive. They tend not to do it physically, not to the degree men do, so they use other channels. And what other channels are there other than physical aggression if you're going to be aggressive? Well, you go after people verbally. You go after them with innuendo and gossip and reputation destruction. And that's how it works.
And just to be clear, that you think that's predominantly a female modus operandi?
It isn't that I think that.
Well,
it's that the clinical literature indicates that. It isn't that I think it.
Well, I'm not interviewing the clinical literature. I'm interviewing you. What do you think?
Well, I'm a psychologist and a scientist, and I tend to base my opinions on what I've read in the broad relevant clinical literature. I'm not making this stuff up. I studied antisocial behavior for like 15 years. I'm actually quite an expert on it. And so we know that men are more likely to look at it this way. All right. Women are much more likely to try to commit suicide. And men are much more likely to kill themselves. And the reason for that is that men use lethal force and women don't. Now that's a big difference. Okay, so then you say, well, women manifest aggression towards themselves and to others, but they don't use lethal force. They don't use physical force the same way men do. So they have to do it some other way.
Why do they have to do something some other way?
Because people are aggressive.
You rightly picked up on the disruptive effect of social media, but also the technological shifts in media and mass media consumption. My argument was that this might be, leading to a polarization, that people like you who are immensely successful within this milieu, but there is that, that point that you become part of the problem, that you've put your finger on yourself. You want people to get along together. You want men and women to sort of trade off. We don't agree entirely where these trade-offs are, but, we're here and arguing about it. And yet, at the same time, you succeed most when you say something very provocative that goes viral. You think you're sort of trapped in a paradox.
I don't think that's when I succeed most. So, for example, one of the incidents that propelled me to success, let's say, in terms of public recognition in the UK was my interview with Cathy Newman. And the reason that propelled me to success wasn't because I said something provocative, but because I refused under substantial duress to say anything provocative. And so part of the reason that I've become popular to the degree that I have been is that I'm actually very good at keeping my temper under situations where there's substantial reason not to, let's say. And I would also say that the good that I've done with regards to my online lectures far outweighs whatever harm might be done by the fact that people are cutting them and making provocative titles out of them and construing this as some sort of fundamental political war.
But it's not just other people, is it? If you look at something like the model that you partly use to promote your work is the crowdfunding site. So the more you incite a reaction, the more loyal your Patreon site, the more loyal the subscribers become, the more money is raised for causes that you want to promote.
No, that isn't how it works. The reason that, first of all, I give away all my content online for free. So the people who subscribe to Patreon are subscribing to nothing. They're supporting me, and they're not supporting me because of my political stance primarily. They're supporting me because they've watched my videos and they've been helped by them as individuals, and they're hoping that can happen to a lot of other people.
But if you want to give, if you see it as self-help and you want to give it away for nothing, then why bring money into the equation at all, and why have this sort of high-octane sort of crowdsourcing? Does rely on people coming to you wanting to pledge their money. Why put money into it at all? Isn't this an area where the market might be better left out?
I am an evil capitalist after all, and I don't really make any apologies for that.
Why do you want to monetize?
Well, because I can do useful things with money, and partly because I'm curious, partly because I need to live, partly because my job was at risk for a long while and that's not going to happen to me again, partly because I had to give up my clinical practice because of other considerations, partly because I have a family, partly because I want to build an online university.
Is it about raising money for a cause, or is it about raising money for you?
Well, I don't separate myself from what I'm doing, so I can't really answer that question. I mean, for me, what, am I going to buy a yacht? No. I'm not a luxury kind of guy. I'm not looking to live the high life. I'm 55 years old, for God's sake. What would I do with that? I have lots of things that I would do with some money. One of the things I want to do is build an online university, but it's not the only thing I want to do. And so I would put the money to good use, I suspect, or at least to reasonable use. And the reason that people are providing me with this money, which they don't have to do, is because they hope that I'll continue to do what I'm doing. And that is exactly the reason they're providing it with me. And my leftist critics have been saying for consistently, it's actually quite comical. Well, look at all the money that Dr. Peterson is generating with his Patreon account. It's like, well, I'm not selling anything. All the stuff I do online is free. It's not even advertising supported. So if people want to support me on Patreon because they think that what I'm doing is helpful, then more power to them as far as I'm concerned.
Do you feel that your kind of hearing works better in one direction than the other?
No, I don't think so. I mean, this week, for example, I was accused by a Jewish newspaper of harboring sympathies, which was rather miserable. But at the same time, an alt-right article came out today telling me that I was a stooge and a shill for the Jews. So, they figure I'm pretty much in the middle if I can attract that sort of criticism on both sides. And with regards to the right-wing issue, The right wing does not pose a threat to the integrity of universities in North America and Europe, but the left wing certainly does, and that's well documented, and not by me. There are no conservatives in universities, in the social sciences and the humanities. They don't exist, and that's not a good thing. And the radical left in universities absolutely exists and has utterly threatened the integrity of those institutions. And so to the degree that I've concentrated on the radical left, it's because the radical left has usurped the universities. Here's the right question. How do I make myself into the perfect date? You answer that question, and you will not have any problem answering the previous question. It's like, what do I want in a partner? If I offered everything I could to a partner, who would I be? You work on that. Ask that question. Just ask. Just ask yourself, okay, I have to be the person that women would want. Okay, what do they want? Clean. That's not a bad start. Reasonably good physical shape. So healthy, productive, generous, honest, willing to delay gratification. So you dance with a woman. It's like, what's she doing? What are you two doing? Well, it's a pattern. There's patterns happening around you. That's the music. Patterns. Patterns of being. That's the music. Now, can you align yourself with the patterns of being gracefully? That's what she's checking out. And then can you do that with her? And then can you do that in a playful and attentive manner and keep your bloody hands to yourself for at least a minute? And so, can you dance in a playful manner? It's like you can go through this in your imagination. And you'll know. And then you think, well, how far am I from those things? And the answer is usually, man, it's a pretty horrible abyss separating you from that ideal. But the harder you work on offering other people what they need and want, the more people will line up to play with you. And then you think, well, if I do that, people will just take advantage of me. And that's the non-naive objection, right? Because the naive person thinks, well, I'll be good and everyone will treat me right. It's like, the cynic says, no, I'll be good and someone will take me out. And that's why you're supposed to be as soft as a dove and as wise as a serpent. I know you're full of snakes. I know it. Maybe I know it more than you do. But we'll play anyways. We know what happens if people act poorly, if men act badly. We know that the world turns into something that's so close to hell that the difference is trivial. That's the story of the 20th century.
Give them this message that it's okay to be a man.
It's not okay. It's necessary.
Why do you think there is such a crisis of masculinity in the first place? And why are there so many people out there who are angry at you for even talking to men?
What I see happening to young men in particular, boys as well, not just young men, and maybe even, maybe starting at the age of toddlers, is that we have this sense in the world that human beings live in antagonism to nature and that we're actually a malevolent force. And that our social structures, which are clearly capable of the commission of atrocity, are fundamentally oppressive, patriarchal in their nature. And so then if you're a male in a society with that ethos, the motive force that drives you into the world to live is associated with rapaciousness and despoliation on the natural front, and then oppression and atrocity on the social front. It's like, well then, if you're the least bit conscientious, because this sort of accusation hurts conscientious young men the most, then the best you can do is, well, let's say castrate yourself. How would that be? And that would be real comical, except that it's also happening. That's why I think there's a crisis. And there's something serious at the root of it, right? Because we do have to take the potential damage we can do to the natural world and the social world. We have to take that seriously, but the proper consequence of taking that seriously is not to commit hara-kiri, let's say, in a fit of moral anxiety and take yourself completely out of the game. But that's the insistence now, and it's really, and I see that psychoanalytically, I see that as a manifestation at a symbolic level of something like, well, symbolically, that's associated with the devouring mother, right? It's It's an overweening and destructive false compassion that has this devouring quality. But then there's another issue too, which I think is germane. Because of family fragmentation, there's a very large number of women who have, just like there's a very large number of men who have never had a real word of encouragement in their whole life. It's a really sad thing to see. It's a really, really sad thing to see that deeply and to have seen that reflected in so many thousands of people. But there are many women who've never had a positive relationship with anyone male in their life. And so one of the consequences of that, we know, for example, that younger women are more likely to be attracted to men who show dark triad traits, narcissistic, Machiavellian, and psychopathic. And people who have those traits are characterized by the mimicry of competence. And so what women want in men more than anything else is competent generosity, and the data on that are very clear. But you can mimic that if you're narcissistic, and if you're a young woman, you can be deluded by that. It's partly because it points to the problem of dissociating competent confidence from the expression of power per se. So we could call power, I'll define that as the willingness and ability to use compulsion to attain your aims. Now, if you are someone who has a proclivity to manifest power, then that looks like the manifestation of both ambition and will. And if you haven't had a positive relationship with anyone masculine in your life, and maybe with not even with your own internal masculinity, say, you can't discriminate between power and the ambition that serves competence. And so because that's terrifying, because the power, if you have had only negative relationships with men, their capability to use power becomes such a threat that it has to be opposed at all costs, even if it manifests itself within the developmental pathway of your own son.
How would you summarize why men are in crisis now?
I think it's because in a deep level, the West has lost faith in the idea of masculinity. Now, that's no different than the death of God. It's the same thing. And Nietzsche knew what the consequence of that would be. I mean, that's most of what he wrote about, and so you'd say, well, the divine symbol of masculinity has been obliterated. Well, so then what do you expect? What's going to happen? That means masculinity is going to become weak. And especially if the symbol is also denigrated, right? Which it definitely is. So what that means is that the ideal that man could aspire to is denigrated. And well, then with your ideal in tatters, you're weak. That's definitional. I think the reason that men have been responding positively to my thinking, let's say, is that I don't buy any of that. I like the masculine spirit. It's necessary, and it's not fundamentally carnage and pillaging. It's not fundamentally rape culture. It's not fundamentally world destroying. And all of those things all of those aspersions have been cast upon it.
What is a masculinity we can aspire to?
Well, it's responsibility fundamentally, and it's to put it symbolically, is that your responsibility is to incarnate the spirit of the Logos. That's your responsibility. That's your role in life. But we know what happens if people act poorly, if men act badly. We know what happens. We know that the world turns into something that's so close to hell that the difference is trivial. We know that. That's the story of the 20th century. So we should learn that lesson. And what that lesson is pick up the world on your shoulders and walk forward. Pick up the world with all of its trouble, with all of its suffering, with all of its evil, and move forward with it. And in bearing that burden, learn that you're the sort of creature that can bear that burden and therefore deserving of respect.
We've met some of your fans, and we got the impression they were all male fans, the ones that we talked to. And that they were struggling with their manhood, and that you give them this message that it's okay to be a man.
It's not okay. It's necessary. What the hell are we going to do without men?
You look around the city here, you see all these buildings go up, these men, they're doing impossible things. They're under the streets, working on the sewers, they're up on the power lines in the storms and the rain. They're keeping this impossible infrastructure functioning, this thing that works in a miraculous manner. They work themselves to death, and often literally. And the gratitude for that is sorely lacking, especially among the people who should be most grateful. You see university professors, especially of the social justice bent, who are among the most protected and privileged people that the world has ever produced. They take everything they have for granted, failing to understand entirely that there's a massive infrastructure of unbelievably hardworking, solidly laboring, working class men breaking themselves in half on a regular basis, making sure that everything that always breaks works. And so a little gratitude for that is in order. And it's very useful to tell everyone, not just men, that they have an important role to play, a necessary role, and that if they act properly and honestly and forthrightly, that they can put their lives together and they can help their families and they can make their communities better, and that that's not toxic masculinity, that appalling phrase. It's what keeps the world going round. We're made in the image of God, and it's hard to say what that means, but it means, at least in part, to participate in the process of bringing the good into being, and we can all do that. There's this idea that came up in the 60s that you're okay the way you are. And well, I don't like that idea very much. And I think it's a very bad idea, especially when you're talking to young people who are lost and nihilistic and depressed and suffering and aimless and ideologically possessed and prematurely cynical. Because they're not okay the way they are. And if you tell them that they are, then they think, well, this is it, that's life. It's like I've hit the pinnacle at 18. I don't know anything about the world. I haven't contributed anything to it. But there's no up because I'm okay the way they are, the way I am. It's like, you're not okay the way you are, especially if you're 18. You've got 60 years to put yourself together, and you better be better at the end of that than you were at the beginning, or something has gone seriously wrong. And so it's not an optimistic thing to tell people that they're okay the way they are. It's a pessimistic thing, because what you do is denigrate what they could be for what they are. And I know that is a terrible idea, technically speaking, from a psychological perspective, because it's who you could be that imbues your life with meaning. It's not the only thing. I mean, you have your friends and your family, but they expect something from you too, you know? They expect the best from you. They expect a certain amount of improvement, especially if you have children. But even if you are a child, you might expect some improvement from your parents as well. But that's what you hope for, is you hope that the person can manifest what's best in them. And if they don't do that, then you're disappointed in them, just like you would be inexorably or are inexorably disappointed in yourself if you don't manifest what's best in you. And I think that that's very interesting moral law. I talk a lot to my audiences about what I believe to be incontrovertible facts. And I think that the fundamental incontrovertible fact is that life is suffering. And I think that that's why that's a primary axiom of religious belief, in some sense almost regardless of the faith, that life is suffering. And everyone knows that, although they don't necessarily like to admit it or to talk about it. I mean, you don't have to scrape beneath the surface very far in someone's life to find a tragedy lurking if the person that you're speaking with doesn't have something pretty awful happening to them right at the moment, economically or socially or within their family or physically or mentally. The probability that someone they love has a problem of that sort is extraordinarily high. And if you happen to be among the fortunate minority for whom that isn't true, well,
all you have to do is wait, and it will be true soon enough, and sooner than you think, and worse than you imagine. And so, and everyone knows that, and so it's easy to understand why people become cynical and bitter and hurt and nihilistic. Now, I think there's a progression in life. You know, if you're naive, you think that life will be easy and that people are basically good, and then you have some experiences if you're not sheltered too much, and that gets taken away from you because you betray yourself, or other people betray you, or you encounter a tragedy, and then your naivety is shattered, and the most likely place that you'll go from there is into something approximating cynicism, because you don't know the alternative, and your initial faith, which was not faith but naivety, is shattered by the terrible reality of what you encounter. And then you, as a cynical person, you're more wise than you are as a naive person. And that's a strange thing, because you're worse in some sense than you were. You know, you're not as optimistic, and you're not as filled with hope, and your life is more difficult. And you're probably harder on other people, and with more of a tendency towards cruelty. And none of that seems positive, but there's a wisdom in cynicism that the naive lack. But the problem is there that cynicism is not a useful antidote to, let's say, tragedy and malevolence, because there are places that you go past cynicism as you approach wisdom, and it's wisdom that you need in order to fabricate yourself this sort of vessel that will keep you afloat during stormy times. And so I talk to my audiences about wisdom, and I tell them other things that I believe to be true. It's like, well, life is difficult, and it's tainted by malevolence, and it's cast in tragedy, and you need something to offset that, because otherwise it embitters you. And if you're embittered, then you become vengeful and cruel, inevitably. And then you make everything that's made you worse in turn. And there's no bottom to that, you know, as anyone who's even a moderate student of history soon comes to understand. Well, there's an idea that hell is a bottomless pit, and the reason for that is that there's no situation that's so terrible that there isn't some damn fool thing that some idiot can do that will make it far worse. And it's reasonably probable that you're that idiot. The question is, what might constitute an alternative to that? And if there is an alternative, and you know, I learned a while back, long while back, reading religious mythology mostly, that there is a difference between thinking and paying attention, and of the two, paying attention is much more important. It's not the same thing as thinking. Like, when you pay attention, you're looking for what you don't know. Like, you kind of detach yourself, and you watch, and you listen, and you see if things are the way you think they are, and you hope they are, because life is easier if things are the way you think they are. But if you find out that they're not, and you're paying attention, then you can weave, and you can bob, and you can adapt, and you can learn. And so you have to learn to pay attention. And I just ask people when I'm speaking to pay attention to what they already know. And here's something that everybody knows. You know, in a world that consists of suffering and malevolence, who is it that you admire? Or who is it that you don't admire? Those are the same question. If you know who you don't admire, well, then you have a negative model, and you can go for the opposite. And if you know who you admire, well, then you can copy that. And the instinct for admiration is an instinct for imitation, and we're very imitative creatures. And our instinct for admiration is the instinct for imitation. And
what would you call it, a deeply biologically and metaphysically rooted guideline to the proper path of life. The question is there a proper path of life? Well, there's certainly pathways that make things worse. That's something to know. You could avoid those. And if there are pathways that make things worse, then there are the opposite pathways, even though those might not be so clear. I think that's why we're often so enamored of evil characters in fictional representations, is because it's clearer, it's easier in some sense to make what constitutes the dark path clearer. It's easier for people to understand, whereas the path that's positive is murkier and more difficult to ascertain. But at the very least, you know it's the opposite of that. You say, well, who do you admire? Or we could start by, who don't you admire? Well, you don't admire an adult who won't take responsibility for himself or herself, and could. You know, I understand there are people that are so broken and hurt that they need help constantly because they can't take responsibility for themselves, or they can in small ways, but not completely. But you don't admire someone who won't take responsibility for themselves. In fact, you have a sense of contempt for that. And if you happen to be that person, then you'll wake up in the middle of the night and berate yourself with what's left of your conscience for failing to undertake your moral duty, your intrinsic moral duty. And you can't escape that. And that's so interesting, that you can't escape that. If you were the creature who could invent your own values, as Nietzsche suggested, as an antidote to the death of God, then you just forgive your transgressions and you wouldn't suffer the bitter pangs of conscience, but you do. And the reason you do is because you're doing things that are wrong and you should stop, and you know it, and maybe you can't. And then, well, let's say then the opposite is that you admire someone who can take responsibility for himself or herself. That's a start. And then maybe you admire someone even more if they've forged their character sufficiently to move past cynicism, so that not only they take responsibility for themselves, but they can take responsibility for their family. And they're there for the people who love them when it's necessary. And if you do that, then you have something, I wouldn't say necessarily to be proud of, but at least you have one less thing to upbraid yourself with. And that's something. And then you can move past that and you can say, maybe if you put yourself together enough, carefully enough, spoke the truth enough, were courageous enough, in spite of the reasons you have not to be, that you could also be someone of benefit to yourself and your family and your community, and you partake in structuring things in a harmonious manner by living in that way. It's not an individual focused ethos. It's an ethos of harmony among levels. You should do what's good for you, but it has to be what's good for your family at the same time, and it has to be what's good for you and your family and your community at the same time. And that works musically, it makes all the levels work in harmony. And you can tell when that's happening. And this is another thing that's of great utility to know, is that when you're in that place where you're acting in the proper manner and you're facing things courageously and you're speaking the truth, you're imbued with a sense of fundamental meaning. And that meaning is the antidote to the catastrophe of life. And it's the antidote psychologically, because you have to have that meaning, because otherwise your life is too dark and too dreadful and it will corrupt you. So it's the antidote psychologically, but it's also the antidote practically, because we're not nothing, us human beings. They say that we're made in the image of God, and it's hard to say what that means, but it means, at least in part, to participate in the process of bringing the good into being. And we can all do that, and the opposite. And if we accept our responsibility to ourselves and to other people and to our communities, and we lift that load up, then we live lives that are meaningful, and that stops us from being corrupt. It provides us with a medication against catastrophe, and it also practically improves the world. That's the other thing. It's not just psychological. You can make things worse. Everyone knows that. And no doubt you have in many ways. But you can make things better. And they actually get better. And there's a reason for hope. And there's something to be said to know that you're the sort of creature that can look mortality and catastrophe and malevolence straight in the eye, so to speak, and nonetheless stand up and do what's right, and that all there is in that is good. And that's what I've been telling people. Thank you very much.